Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air for the 12th week of 2013. Aware is the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. It's the 10th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq and approaching the 12th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. Whenever the American people have voted on these matters in those years, they voted against war. But the U.S. government continues to massacre people around the world. As we recall the Bush administration's deceitful mass murder in Iraq, it's important to note that it was not an isolated event. It was part of the U.S. government's policy towards the Middle East in every administration since World War II, up to and including the Obama administration. This program, recorded on March 19th, is devoted to discussing what the U.S. government is doing now in our name, as that is illuminated by history. We'll discuss the Obama administration's widening of these wars in Southwest Asia and North Africa, and the political conditions in the U.S. that make Obama's mass murder possible. You may have noticed that the president, off to Israel this week, doesn't seem to want to talk much about the war, much less tell the truth about it. In his inaugural address in January, President Obama said a decade of war is now ending. But that's not true. And of course, he knows it's not true. There is, in fact, no plan to end U.S. combat, even in Afghanistan, only an announced goal to lower troop levels, and the number of remaining troops keeps growing, in spite of the opposition even of the puppet president we installed in Afghanistan. In his State of the Union speech last month, President Obama announced that 34,000 of the 66,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan will be brought back to the United States within 12 months. But that will leave more U.S. troops in Afghanistan than were there when Obama became president. But Obama's war is by no means limited to AFPAC, the theater of war that includes Afghanistan and Pakistan. And by the way, there's an excellent article in this week's New York Review of Books by Anatole Levin about the situation in AFPAC. There's very little good stuff in the press about it, but that's one. In addition, though, the United States is deploying troops in 35 African countries, beginning with Libya, Sudan, Algeria, and Niger. President Obama announced this on Christmas Day this past winter. It's as if Africa's proud history of liberation, from Patrice Lumumba to Nelson Mandela, is consigned to oblivion by the U.S. government's suborning of African governments whose historic mission, warned Frantz Fanon half a century ago, is the promotion of a capitalism rampant though camouflaged. It's the Obama administration, as much or more than the terrorists, who want war in the Middle East and Africa, consistently with the policy followed by all U.S. administrations for more than a generation. An ongoing war gives the U.S. a justification for military control of the world's energy-producing region. Today, the U.S. government is threatening, invading, and occupying countries in a vast circle with a 2,500-mile radius around the Persian Gulf, from North Africa to the borders of India and China, a region sometimes called the Greater Middle East. The U.S. military calls it Central Command. This region has the world's greatest concentration of oil and natural gas, and our government is spending hundreds of billions of dollars, month after month, to control it. Control, and not just access to these energy resources, is what our government demands. We, in fact, import little of our own oil supplies from the Mideast. Most of it comes from the Western Hemisphere, notably Canada and Venezuela. But control of world energy gives the U.S. an unparalleled advantage over our economic rivals in Europe and Asia. This past June, the Senate committee chaired by President Obama's new Secretary of State, John Kerry, released a report describing how Washington needs to maintain key military bases and troop presence throughout the Middle East, which is vital because the region is, quote, home to more than half of the world's oil reserves and over a third of its natural gas. The United States should preserve the model of lily pad bases throughout the Gulf, said the report, which permits the rapid escalation of military force, enabling the United States to quickly deploy its superior conventional force throughout the region. In other words, President Obama is killing men, women, and children in Asia and Africa in our name because China and other countries need oil, and our government intends to have control over where they get it. Our government says that we're conducting these vastly expensive wars to stop terrorism and protect civilians. But we can see that instead we're killing civilians and creating terrorists. These wars are not in Americans' interest because it's the 1% who profit from them through armaments and oil. The Obama administration's innovation in the U.S. war in the Mideast and Africa is to add assassinations by drone or death squad. The U.S. Special Operation Command is, amazingly enough, active in 120 countries, according to the command spokesman. President Obama has killed between 3,000 and 5,000 people, including at least 200 children, with drone attacks on Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen, countries with which we are not at war, and some of which are supposed to be our allies. The U.S. and NATO have bombed and killed Muslims in 8 countries during the Obama administration, after Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Libya, Somalia, Mali, and even the Philippines. And that does not count the numerous lethal tyrannies propped up by the West. In different circumstances, President Obama recently said, quote, "There's no country on earth that would tolerate missiles raining down on its citizens from outside its borders," close quote. Of course, he was talking about Israel. And of course, that's exactly what he's doing, including killing American citizens with his rockets. Obama's problem is the American people, who, in spite of the war cheerleading by the media, do not want more war. Therefore, he wants to find an effective way to lie to them that the war is winding down, even as he expands it. President Bush, in addition to launching a lying invasion of Iraq 10 years ago, kidnapped people around the world and tortured them in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. Obama simply murders them. History will record that our chief executive is a practiced liar as well as a murderer. You're watching Aware on the Air. Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, is made up of people who believe that if Americans actually knew what the U.S. government is doing in their name, they would be appalled. Tonight we'll hear from the following members and friends of Aware. Ron Szoke on Was Iraq Worth It? Stuart Levy on anti-war events in Champaign-Urbana, and some videos on the war and the economy. I'm Carl Estabrook, and I'll be back with some comments on slaughter and forgetting. But we'll start with Ron Szoke and his animal companion here, I guess.
Actually, the owl is one of the attributes of Minerva, and before her Athena, representing wisdom, apparently. And earlier I've mentioned the statement by the philosopher Hegel that the owl of Minerva, representing wisdom, flies only at dusk. Yeah. We get wise about these things only too late, after the damage has been done, and we seem unable to avoid these things that, in my view, have led to the catastrophe of the Iraq or the Middle East war generally for both the United States and all of the nations of the Middle East. So there's the owl of Minerva, and have we got wisdom? Well, some reporters are going around interviewing Army officers, military officers who were involved in the Vietnam War, and to a man they say, oh yes, it was worth it. We must evaluate that statement, I think, with keeping in mind several considerations. One is if they want to continue to have a career in the military, they must, of course, say that. And the 4,600 or so Americans who died there, and the many, many thousands more who were injured, wounded, maimed for life, very severely in some cases, were not interviewed, and they weren't asked whether it was worth it. So I think we ought to evaluate that statement with some skepticism. What would it mean for it to be worth it? Here's a report on what the war cost in money terms, in addition to the carnage. The U.S. war in Iraq, according to this report by Daniel Trotta from Reuters, has cost $1.7 trillion, with an additional $490 billion in benefits owed to war veterans. Expenses that could grow to more than $6 trillion over the next 4 decades, counting interest, a study released on Thursday said. The war has killed at least 134,000 Iraqi civilians and may have contributed to the deaths of as many as 4 times that number, according to the Costs of War project by the Watson Institute of International Studies at Brown University. When security forces, insurgents, journalists, and humanitarian workers were included, the war's death toll rose to an estimated 176,000 to 189,000, the study said. The report, the work of about 30 academics and experts, was published in advance of the 10th anniversary of the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq on March 19th, 2003. So the war was being fought off budget, off the books, and now the chickens are coming home to roost. As someone has said aptly, the sky is dark with all of those chickens, the consequences of our foolishness 10 years ago. So opinion turned against the war within 3 or 4 years. It was began to be seen as futile and senseless and too costly. But what impressed me at the time was the initial enthusiasm for it, the war fever that took over the country early on. And the line we were hearing, I was hearing at least from a number of people, well, the president must know something that we don't. And it's an unfortunate line. It could be used, for example, to justify Hitler and Stalin and anyone else at the top of the hierarchy. I wonder if the same line was used on the dissidents in Germany and the Soviet Union a good many years ago. So a number of people still haven't learned, apparently. Paul Krugman wrote a column, Marches of Folly, echoing the title of Barbara Tuchman's book of 1984 about the March of Folly, which was mainly devoted to Vietnam. But he says, 10 years ago, America invaded Iraq. Somehow our political class decided that we should respond to a terrorist attack by making a war on a regime that, however vile, had nothing to do with that attack. Some voices warned that we were making a terrible mistake, that the case for war was weak and possibly fraudulent, and that far from yielding the promised easy victory, the venture was all too likely to end in costly grief. All those warnings were, of course, right, Krugman says. Another article in Truth Out, Democrats share the blame for the tragedy of war. The approval of the war, the enthusiasm for it, the cheerleading and drum beating went on in both major political parties. One of the lines being used now, retrospectively, and justification, is that everyone thought that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which is clearly and provably false. There were a lot of voices saying, look, there is no real evidence for that. But it's still being used by some people. So it's easy to show that that's completely wrong. The next piece is actually from the Voice of America. They were interviewing people in the rural community of Marseilles, Illinois, struggling to understand the Iraq War 10 years later. Public opinion surveys in 2011 at the end of the U.S. military involvement in Iraq revealed that a majority of Americans felt the U.S. invasion there was a mistake. War casualties had a major role in shaping Americans' feelings about the war, and now 10 years after the invasion that toppled Saddam Hussein from power, those sentiments persist. Relatives and friends of those who were lost in the war continued to struggle to come to terms with the meaning of the conflict and its consequences. Those who lost a son or a brother or a husband in the war simply cannot admit that it was all a mistake, it was a fraud, it was futile, and not to mention a crime against humanity. On a cold, wintry March afternoon, Iraqi war veteran Harvey Cantor is fighting back tears as he fights through the snow to create a keepsake that reminds him of the friends he lost. You don't forget the names, and you don't forget how it happened, he said. The names he won't forget on the Mideast Conflicts Wall Memorial in Marcellus, Illinois, belong to 3 men Cantor served with in the U.S. Army at the height of the insurgency in Iraq. Casualties of an unpopular conflict, Cantor says, is fading from America's collective memory. I never want to look at it and say, hey, it was a mistake, it was worthless when you have all those lives lost, said John Bartosiewicz. 2 of his sons served in the military, but neither served in Iraq. While he says he supported the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, was also relieved when Americans left in 2011. If they would have just pulled out without setting a goal and reaching that goal, then I would have thought it was worthless because all those lives were lost and you can't put a value on that. So that is the problem for many people. So much money was spent, so many lives were lost. And can we say now that it was a mistake, that it was wrong, that it wasn't worth it? And many people just cannot bring themselves to say that. 10 years later, the Iraq War is still a failure. Here are some of the things that you heard at the time and some reflections on them. They said it would be a cakewalk. It was hell. According to the Department of Defense figures, 4,486 Americans were killed and 32,223 wounded. And an estimated 134,000 Iraqi civilians were also killed and may have contributed to the deaths of 4 times that number, according to the Costs of War project at Brown University, which I quoted before. They said it would be cheap, $50 billion to $60 billion. Actually, it cost 31 times as much, $1.7 trillion, the Brown study says, and that's before an additional $469 billion in benefits owed to war veterans. Factor in veterans' care and interest, and the true cost over the next 40 years could well be $6 trillion. Point 3, they said Iraq oil would pay for it. Completely laughable. There's a lot of money to pay for this. It doesn't have to be U.S. taxpayer money. Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz testified to Congress on March 27th, 2003. The oil revenue of that country could bring in between $50 and $100 billion over the course of the next 2 or 3 years. We're dealing with a country that could really finance its own reconstruction, and relatively soon. Nope. The big winners in Iraq's oil stakes were 2 countries that opposed the war, Russia and China, both of which received multi-billion-dollar contracts from the Iraqi government in a landmark 2009 action. Point 4, they said that war would make America safer. Obviously, it's made it much less safe. It's created enormous resentment among the people of the Middle East, who now view America as their enemy, and apparently a number of them are still looking for ways to strike back. Point 5, they said it would be a just war that would uphold American values. The international goodwill America had in the wake of the September 11th terror attacks quickly evaporated after the Iraqi war began, particularly after searing images of Baghdad's Abu Ghraib prison and reports of torture and abuse bounced around the world. So what did we accomplish with our invasion and occupation of Iraq? Did it help our economy, make us safer, make us friends around the world? The facts, it would seem, make clear and compelling case to the contrary. So have we learned anything? Well, I'm not sure. Next point, last point. Israel is said to be urging Obama on his visit there this week to join in American airstrikes against Syria. I hear over and over again from Israel another war with Hezbollah is inevitable, a U.S. official said. An anonymous Israeli official has told The Guardian that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu plans to use time during President Obama's upcoming Israel visit to gain U.S. support for possible military strikes against Syria. The line being that Syria is sending weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon. So this will bring on a war, military action against not only Syria but Lebanon as well in its train if we go along with Netanyahu. So there's a situation. Was it worth it? I think that's completely laughable. But again, the owl of wisdom flies too late, it seems, for our leaders, and they are committed to foolishness and idiocy. In many cases, it seems beyond comprehension. That's all.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. While Ron is out chasing his owl, I see a little Harry Potter reference there, perhaps, John. I don't know.
No.
In any case, and making the important point, of course, that the wisdom after the fact is what we have, and indeed we should pay attention to it. We might also remember that the largest anti-war demonstrations in history occurred on the eve of George Bush's invasion of Iraq 10 years ago this week. And not just in the United States, although they were the largest anti-war demonstrations in the United States. And even with reference to the anti-war demonstrations of the 1960s against the American war in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. We might ask what became of that anti-war movement. There have been many people quick to say the anti-war movement of 10 years ago evaporated like the snows of yesteryear. I think that's false. The movement never really went away. And I have a statement here by a group of people who've been involved during those 10 years in the American anti-war movement, a large group of them. The statement was organized by Phyllis Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, which itself goes back to Vietnam times. But there is part of the story here that we do need to pay attention to, and that's the fact that, as I mentioned at the top, Americans, whenever they've had a chance to vote on the war or appear to vote on the war over that 10-year period, indeed in a longer period, have voted against it. And for that very reason, the Democrats and President Obama realized that they could take the presidency from the Republicans in 2008 if and only if they could organize that anti-war movement on their side. Which they did pretty successfully. The account of those years, Hope and Change, remember, it was pretty clear what sort of change was envisioned, was designed precisely to organize that anti-war movement for the Obama administration. And the extent to which they did is shown by the success of Obama, even when it became clear, even in his first administration, that he was continuing President Bush's war policies in the Middle East, including the war policies in Iraq. Here is the statement, to add a point to that. The anti-war movement, however co-opted, never finally disappeared. Aware, our local example, is only one of the many small groups across the country that carried on that battle. And here, as I say, is a statement from a large number of them put together this last week. The U.S. war against Iraq was illegal and illegitimate. It violated the UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions, and a whole host of international laws and treaties. It violated U.S. laws and our Constitution with impunity. And it was all based on lies about non-existent links between Iraq and al-Qaeda, about never were ties between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden, about Iraq's invisible weapons of mass destruction, and about Baghdad's supposed nuclear program, with derivative lies about uranium yellow cake from Niger, certain irony there in recent events in Niger, and aluminum rods from China. There were lies about U.S. troops being welcomed in the streets with sweets and flowers, and lies about thousands of jubilant Iraqis spontaneously tearing down the statue of a hated dictator. One of the most interesting things in the news, once again not in the American press that I saw, but in the international news this last week, was an interview with the Iraqi sledgehammer wielder who had worked on trying to tear down that statue of Saddam Hussein, was finally torn down by an American tank. And the initial invasion of Baghdad, and how much he regrets now the American invasion, how much misery it's brought to Iraq, and how his opposition to Saddam was used, in fact, by the Americans for their purposes. It's quite an interesting interview. The fact the guy is still around and willing to talk to at least international journalists is a shows that he's at least survived the occupation, but he's not happy about it. To continue the statement from the anti-war groups, then there was the lie that the U.S. could send hundreds of thousands of soldiers and billions of dollars worth of weapons across the world to wage war on the cheap. We didn't have to raise taxes to pay the almost $1 trillion the Iraq war has cost so far, and Ron talked about the expanded estimate. In fact, there are estimates that run up to $6 trillion for the total cost of the war. And as George Bush said, we should go shopping instead. Behind these myths, the costs were huge, human, economic, and more. More than 1 million U.S. troops were deployed to Iraq. 4,483 were killed. 33,183 were wounded, and more than 200,000 came home with PTSD. The number of Iraqi civilians killed is still unknown. At least 121,754 are known to have been killed directly during the U.S. war, but hundreds of thousands more died from crippling sanctions, diseases caused by dirty water when the U.S. destroyed the water treatment system, and the inability to get medical help because of exploding violence. The excellent program Democracy Now! This morning featured the recent report from Brown University, from one researcher at Brown University on the cost of the war, and a further report suggesting that even the numbers from Brown University are a strikingly low estimate of the immense damage done to the society by the war. And what are we leaving behind? After almost a decade, the U.S. finally pulled out most of its troops and Pentagon-paid contractors, mercenaries. About 16,000 State Department-paid contractors and civilian employees are still stationed at the giant U.S. Embassy compound and 2 huge consulates, along with unacknowledged CIA and FBI agents, special forces, and a host of other undercover operatives. The U.S. just sold the Iraqi government 140 M1 tanks, and American-made fighter jets are in the pipeline, too. But there's little question that the all-encompassing U.S. military occupation of Iraq is over. After more than 8 years of war, the Iraqi government finally said no more. Their refusal to grant U.S. troops immunity from prosecution for potential war crimes was the deal-breaker that forced President Obama's hand and made him pull out the last 30,000 troops he and his generals were hoping to keep in Iraq. That led to the Kerry report that I mentioned earlier about how lily pad bases, pads, that American military like frogs should sit on, able to jump back in to these countries, are the way to go in the Middle East. But as we knew would be the case, the pull-out by itself did not end the violence. The years of war and occupation have left behind a devastated country, split along sectarian lines, a split the U.S. encouraged, a shredded social fabric with a dispossessed and impoverished population. Iraq remains one of the most violent countries in the world. That's the true legacy of the U.S. war. We owe a great debt to the people of Iraq, and we have not even begun to make good on that commitment. The U.S. lost the Iraq war. Iraq has not been liberated. Violence is rampant. the sectarian violence resulting from early U.S. policies after the 2003 invasion continues to escalate. Of course, we didn't bring democracy and freedom to Iraq. That was never on the U.S. agenda. The failure to liberate Iraq cannot be the basis for assessing the war. The real assessment must be based on whether the war achieved the goals that the Bush administration and its neoconservative military CEO and Pentagon profiteering partners established for this war, consolidating permanent U.S. control over Iraq's oil. As Ron pointed out a moment ago, U.S. oil companies are just some of the myriad of foreign oil interests in Iraq's oil fields, but control, once again, rather than access, is what the U.S. was always interested in. Leaving behind a pro-U.S., anti-Iranian government in Baghdad was one of the things that the U.S. attempted to do in order to establish that control. And that's hardly the case. Prime Minister al-Maliki is barely on speaking terms with anyone in Washington, even though, of course, he owes his job to the United States' response to the Shiite demands for control in Iraq. Furthermore, all but 2 of the 500-plus U.S. bases and outposts were either closed down or turned over to the Iraq military, and once again, the lily pad solution was what the U.S. has settled on. Ensuring that a post-war Iraqi government would allow the U.S. to use Iraq as a jumping-off point to attack Iran is still an open question. And indeed, that question is probably being debated this week in the president's visit to Israel. But the Iraqi government that we installed there is today allied more closely to Iran than to the U.S. and is part of the problem that the U.S. faces in trying to isolate Iran, which has been the goal of U.S. policy vis-a-vis to Iran for a long time. In the build-up to the war, too many media, government officials, academics, and others allowed fear to curb their tongue or their eagerness to curry favor with those in power to stifle their speech. You might notice that in the absence of the anti-war movement, one crucial element of the anti-Vietnam War movement, a campus-based, that is faculty-based, not just student-based, anti-war movement, has been largely absent in recent years. This remains as a crucial lesson as we stand up to the escalation of Obama's drone war and continue to challenge those who call for war against Iran. The war in Iraq began with significant support, with many people accepting the false claims that this new war would bring security to a still frightened U.S. public. But that support did not last long. Within the first years, pro-war assumptions had been reversed, and by the end, the anti-war movement and escalating casualties had turned around public opinion so thoroughly that overwhelming majorities admitted the war in Iraq was wrong and should never have been fought in the first place. And this war showed us our power. It proved the possibility of globalizing opposition even before the war began. The mobilization of February 15, 2003, when the broad United for Peace and Justice coalition in the U.S. joined with allies around the world on that day and said no to war, February 15th created what the New York Times called the second superpower, ready to challenge the U.S. drive towards empire. And that's, in many ways, the story. The neutralization of that second superpower has been the story of the last decade. The U.S. troops left behind a devastated, tortured Iraq. What they didn't leave behind is $1 for reparations or compensation. That battle still lies ahead. The U.S. war in Iraq may be over, but we owe an apology, at least, to all those who suffered from the war, and that apology must be grounded in recognition of our enormous debt to the people of Iraq, a debt for which compensation and reparations are only a start. Our real obligation to the people of Iraq and the region and the rest of the world is to transform our government and our country so that these resource-driven wars, shaped by lies and fought for power and for empire, whether in Iran or somewhere else, can never be waged again. And the notion that that's a settled question seems to me to be quite false. Comment, Ron?
Yes, well, let me underline a couple of points. The statements we've been making could be qualified in the following respect. The war didn't start 10 years ago. In a real sense, the American war against Iraq started 23 years ago. As one commentator has pointed out, unlike the perception that we have in the U.S. that the war started in 2003, the war started in 1991, under Bill Clinton, apparently, or earlier, and Iraq was pretty much destroyed by 2003. When the 2003 invasion happened, it came on top of another 13 years of destruction, very destructive sanctions, and semi-daily bombing campaigns. Remember the no-fly period? Millions of Iraqis have been killed, injured, or displaced. One of the most developed countries in the region at the time of the invasion, Iraq, now is among the worst in terms of infrastructure and public services. Baghdad ranks lowest in the quality of life of any city in the world, according to a recent global survey from the consultant group Mercer. Moreover, the Iraqi national identity has been replaced by ethnic and sectarian affiliations, and indeed 50 more killed in bombings in Baghdad today, I understand. And these explosions are attributed to the Sunni Shiite conflict that erupted after the American invasion and the attempt to eliminate the Ba'ath Party. That's all.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana. One of the events this week that's prompted some discussion online and elsewhere was the election of a new Bishop of Rome, and perhaps in a sidelong glance to the arguments about that, Robert Scheer wrote a piece about Iraq that seemed to me to be quite worthwhile, in part because it ties together what Ron mentioned at the top of the hour, that is the parallels or the connections, such as they are, between the war against Southeast Asia 40-some years ago, which we still insisted calling part for the whole, the Vietnam War, and the war against Southwest Asia and Africa that the Obama administration is conducting now. Robert Scheer writes, it's a staple of our Judeo-Christian heritage that the acknowledgement of sin is a prelude to redemption. So how is it that there is no palpable sense of soul-searching associated with the 10th anniversary of a war based on officially concocted lies and a policy of torture? Is it because the presumption of a unique American claim to an original and enduring innocence perseveres, no matter the death and destruction? Indeed, some of our most celebrated publicists define moral deceit as virtue in justifying the Iraq War. Quote, this is from New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman, "As far as I am concerned, we do not need to find any weapons of mass destruction to justify this war." Close quote. He wrote that in April of 2003, when UN inspectors had clearly established that the proclaimed basis for invading Iraq was a lie. Mr. Friedman continues, Mr. Bush doesn't owe the world any explanation for missing chemical weapons, even it turns out that the White House hyped this issue. Close quote. Interesting choice of words by Thomas Friedman. Hyped this issue, he means even if they were lying about it, which now they clearly were. The big lie, that bane of human existence that when embraced by obvious dictators elsewhere, is perceived as merely hyping when employed by an American president. Lyndon Johnson hyped the non-existent second Gulf of Tonkin attack on American ships to justify expanding the U.S. war in Vietnam. And George W. Bush hyped the fraudulent weapon of mass destruction issue when his fabrication of a connection between Saddam Hussein and the 9/11 attack was proven factually absurd. Even though Iraq never threatened the security of life in the United States, the Bush administration launched a genocidal civil war, replete with a systematic policy of torture directed by U.S. officials at the highest level. Just weeks ago, a devastating documentary produced by The Guardian newspaper and the BBC, outside the United States, of course, provided all the evidence needed for any decent person to demand trials for the perpetrators of an extensive system of Iraqi torture centers operated and financed by the U.S. government. It was part of a policy of stoking a genocidal war of Shiite extremists against Sunnis that was directed by U.S. government veterans of similar efforts in Latin America and elsewhere. The death squads that the U.S. produced in Latin America were exported to Southwest Asia. The lead of the Guardian story was as follows, quote, "The Pentagon sent a U.S. veteran of the dirty wars in Central America to oversee sectarian police commando units in Iraq that set up secret detention and torture centers to get information from insurgents. These units conducted some of the worst acts of torture during the U.S. occupation and accelerated the country's descent into full-scale civil war," close quote. The Guardian is referring here to the war between Sunni and Shia that the U.S. Encouraged and indeed established. This effort, conducted with the full knowledge of then-Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and General David Petraeus, utilized the most violent Shiite militias, including the Savage Badr Brigade, to wreak vengeance on their Sunni opponents. The BBC Guardian investigation exposed our propensity for moral turpitude, with no thanks to the Obama administration, which brazenly closed the door to any serious investigation of the war crimes of the Bush era, and much credit to PFC Bradley Manning and his WikiLeaks trove, which of course told Americans what we were actually doing in Iraq. As The Guardian reported, quote, "Its investigation was sparked by the release of classified U.S. military logs on WikiLeaks that detailed hundreds of incidents where U.S. soldiers came across tortured detainees in a network of detention centers run by the police commandos across Iraq. Private Bradley Manning is facing a prison sentence of up to 20 years after he pleaded guilty to leaking the documents," close quote. There are no trials or prison time for Americans who directed the torture camps that Manning's documents exposed. But such revelations will not likely puncture the sanctimonious stance of presumed American virtue. We make mistakes. We don't commit war crimes. And if word leaks out that we do, it's handled by throwing out a few bad apples from the otherwise pristine bushel. Look what happened to a couple of people connected with Abu Ghraib. Yes, a majority of Americans, 53% according to this week's Gallup poll, think it was, quote, "a mistake sending troops to fight in Iraq 10 years ago. But the lessons of our folly will likely not stick for long. The memories fade, as we now see in that same Gallup poll, with perceptions of the Vietnam War. A majority of Americans ages 18 to 29 believe sending U.S. troops to Vietnam was not a mistake. By contrast, 70% of those 50 and older, the generation with contemporary knowledge of that war, think it was a mistake. That the young now approve of an irrational conflict in which 3.4 million Indochinese and 58,000 Americans died suggests that even the madness that was Iraq will come to be viewed by this fatally jingoistic nation as a good war. You think so, Ron?
That's absolutely staggering. I have hopes, but I don't know. I've become so disillusioned so many times. I don't want to say.
Maybe the owl is airborne, and maybe it's not.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Right. I do have one problem here with some of the language you're using. It seems to me that talking about the war in Iraq or the war in Vietnam as a mistake covers at least two notions. I mean, one is the notion of mistake. Oh, gee, we attacked Iraq and we really meant to attack Australia. You know, we got the maps wrong or something. Mistake in that way. The other sense of mistake, it means, I made a mistake when I went driving while drunk, i.e., I did something quite wrong. Now, it seems to me that the way, no one's suggesting that the war in Iraq was a mistake, although perhaps somebody is, that George Bush just got it in his head that, there were some good reasons to go off and attack Iraq, maybe because they sassed his father, as was said at one point, and that in that sense it was a mistake. But no, when we talk about Iraq being a mistake, we mean that it was wrong to do it. That we should not have done so. And I think that's important. The distinction was made in a series of longitudinal studies of American attitudes about the Vietnam War in the 1960s. And quite remarkably, by 1969, about 70% of the public answered yes to the description of the Vietnam War as fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. Not a mistake, and it's something we got into not knowing what it was, And that distinction, it seems to me, needs to be made about Iraq, too. That what we did in Iraq was fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. And that's why it's particularly shocking that Robert Scheer has numbers that suggest that 70%, those 70% of Americans who thought in 1969 that the war against Vietnam was fundamentally wrong and immoral and not a mistake, probably still do because they're people our age. But that we've lost at least one and perhaps two generations after that. And a lot of young Americans, according to that same Gallup poll, now say, well, of course, the Vietnam War was not a mistake. Yeah. That's very serious.
Yeah. What is their basis for saying that? That just mystifies me, I must say.
Yeah. There's another point, it seems to me, that we need to make here, and that's that these wars, both 40 years ago and today, are not, as it were, separate from American society as a whole, as much as the Bush-Obama administrations have been trying to suggest that it is. You mentioned the off-book nature of the war, that is not part of the regular military budget, and many people have pointed out to the fact that opposition to the Vietnam War was probably encouraged by the fact that we had a draft in those years, and that Americans could be drafted to send to fight in these wars, whereas we have only an economic draft, as it were, in the age of the Southwest Asian wars, where people who can't find jobs elsewhere end up in the military. Maybe so, but it seems to me that it's important to stress the connections between these wars and the American economy, indeed the daily lives of most Americans. And with tax time coming up, you might notice the importance, extent to which your tax money goes directly to pay for these wars. I have just time to mention some other programs here on UPTV, now streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org. Weekdays at 7 a.m., Democracy Now!, 8 a.m., The Big Picture. Wednesday, tomorrow, at 5:15, the European Journal, including a feature on the interesting Italian politician Beppe Grillo. His name means cricket. At 6:45 p.m., the Champaign-Urbana Candidates Forum, a live broadcast for 2.5 hours. At 10:30 p.m., the Populist Dialogues, Cooperative Governments and Tax Reform. At 11 p.m., a repeat of this show. On Thursday, the 21st, at 10:30 a.m., an In Focus special, Francis the Pope from the End of the World. At 1 p.m., a repeat of the Populist Dialogues on tax. At 5:30 p.m., a repeat of the In Focus special on the Pope, which will be repeated yet again on Friday the 22nd at 11:30 a.m. At 2 p.m., Tom Hartman Live, 3 hours, the first hour with Senator Bernie Sanders. At 5 p.m., the European Journal, a rebroadcast. At 7 p.m., News from Neptune. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Szoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, and other members and friends of AWARE, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.